Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the Hull & Chandler Leadership Series. Hull & Chandler is a client-centered law firm providing legal services to individuals, families, businesses, and nonprofits in Charlotte, North Carolina, and throughout the Carolinas. Our award-winning attorneys help our clients resolve problems and find solutions. Our firm specializes in business and contract law, employment law, civil litigation, estates, wills, trusts, personal injury, and commercial real estate, and lending law. And of course, most importantly, nonprofit law and public charity work. If you are interested in learning more about how our attorneys can help you solve your real world problems, visit our website at www.hullandchandler.com and schedule a consultation with one of our award-winning attorneys. The law firm of Hull & Chandler is proud to sponsor the Leadership Series, a program where Hull & Chandler attorney Rocky Cabagnat interviews local and regional leaders in the nonprofit, private, and public sectors to discuss the real-world interplay of law, business, and social dynamics within the context of our continuously changing times. In our firm, his practice helps nonprofits stay legally compliant, avoid legal problems, and resolve legal problems when they come up. Rocky provides legal services to the nonprofit sector through the Fractional General Counsel Program or by providing subscription legal services so nonprofits can always have access to quality legal counsel when they need it, whether it's to review a contract or file a lawsuit on behalf of the nonprofit. Rocky has the experience and education, which is today's topic. He has served as faculty of an ABA accredited law school and served as chief executive officer for a nonprofit that was a Head Start and early Head Start grantee. Take it away, Rocky.
Okay, well, hey, thank you everybody for coming on board today. Anyway, I'm very pleased today for today's guest. I've got Dr. Patton McDowell on today, and we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic, which is very different than what we have normally done with the Leadership Series, where we've kind of tackled a lot of sort of the socio-political, non-social sector issues here in town. You know, from the 2040 plan to issues such as the education equity and the issues with the county and the CMS, but today we're going to talk about a little bit more focus on you, the audience, because I think that well, you know what? How about this? I will read this great promo that was put out that maybe attracted you, and this will kind of give you the flavor of today's show. So, have you thought about transitioning to a nonprofit career? While working in the sector can be immensely rewarding, it comes with a unique set of challenges. Dr. Patton McDowell, president of PMA Consulting and host of the Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership podcast, will share 6 tips to help you determine whether a nonprofit transition is right for you. Additionally, based on his work with leaders at over 240 nonprofit organizations, some of whom have successfully made the leap between corporate America and the nonprofit sectors, he will share advice for how to leverage your valuable corporate experience to jumpstart your new nonprofit career. And so without further ado, I guess Dr. Patton McDowell, and we'll talk a little bit about that, Doctor. Welcome to the Leadership Series.
Rocky, thanks for having me. Great that you're producing this kind of content. Happy to be part of it.
Thank you. Well, you know what, Patton, at the beginning of almost every show that I do, I actually allude to you, and I say I'm going to crib a question from Dr. Patton McDowell. And now I have the actual opportunity to ask you, so I don't even have to give sort of an attribution to you. You're right here in front of me. So I'm just going to ask you, tell the audience who are not super familiar with you or our show or just something, what was your path to nonprofit leadership? I feel like this is kind of the theme of today's discussion. So.
Yeah, I'm delighted because it's become kind of a lifelong crusade to lift up the nonprofit profession as a career opportunity, because I'm an example that I didn't have nonprofit in mind when I was in college. I had an internship, however, with Special Olympics International, and what I thought would be fun to be in Washington, D.C. for a summer actually turned out to be a career-defining opportunity and it informed me that there is real professional opportunity that I think many of your audience may not realize. Of course, if they're listening to this episode, they may be thinking about it. And of course, I'm delighted to lift it up because I had the opportunity to work at an organization, and the founder, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, was still actively involved. And I was just astounded by the complexity and the depth of organizational management required in a nonprofit like that. And of course, I learned then that nonprofit, they're all shapes and sizes. I was at the international office. From there, I began working at the North Carolina state office out of Raleigh. And after 7 years of that, I was hooked. I knew that nonprofit leadership was a real career opportunity.
You said you weren't so when you went to Carolina, like I looked at your and you're Moorhead, so you definitely, this is like good stuff. So when you were in Carolina, did you take any courses whatsoever in nonprofit, or was it, what major were you?
I was an education major. I thought I was going to be a high school English teacher and basketball coach was my dream. And then through the Moorhead program, Rocky, part of that includes summer programs, one of which was an internship. That led me to Special Olympics, which in turn led me to, wow, nonprofit might be a real career opportunity.
So had you not either done the Moorhead or been involved with that summer internship, you might be right now like principal of some high school or something like that.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And what was great though is Special Olympics showed me, one, it had an athletic component and a teaching component. You know, I think it still fulfilled some of the things I was looking for, but it opened my eyes to nonprofits. Because funny, Rocky, when I came back from that internship, a lot of people, and I think this still exists, the perception was, well, that's nice, Pat. And they would kind of pat me on the head and say, nice that you did that, but when are you going to get a real job?
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying, because like, you know, when I graduated law school, you know, I did the corporate internships, you know, like I actually clerked at Womble Carlisle and Winston-Salem for a summer, and I kind of realized I wasn't a corporate person, or at least definitely not in that, not the 25, 28-year-old Rocky who was, you know, and so I went into I was a legal aid attorney after I graduated. And a lot of people just were scratching their head, you know. So I guess I get what you're saying, because they're like, you know, all right, you could have gone to any firm there for, that's where I went to, you know, but you decided to go into legal aid. It sounds like in many ways I feel a kinship with you, Patton, is that, you know, you're a Moorhead scholar. You know, I mean, like these are the people who work at Goldman Sachs and stuff like that. You know, that's kind of I mean, everyone I've known is a Moorhead scholar is like, you know, in New York or DC, you know, and you know, I mean, and not in some sort of public sector thing. I mean, they are definitely like an investment banker or something of that nature. And so I'm really interested. So because I think this is great for those who are in the audience, or those who may very well get this, is that your conversion was early, yet it was still at some point not necessarily foreseen, you know. So again, like you're in a Moorhead program, you go into Carolina, and then you intern at the Special Olympics, and then all of a sudden you're like, I'd like to get into this a little bit more. So tell us a little bit how did you, you know, how did your parents feel? How did you, like everything? How did you, when you went into the Special Olympics, that this is what I'm going to do out of college?
Yeah, it again, at first, I think people viewed it, and perhaps I did too, good experience, but one that I would just move on and, quote, get a real job. But what I was so impressed with, one, was the talent and the caliber of people working in nonprofit leadership made me realize, hey, this is a real opportunity, and had just as much complexity and management requirements that any job does. And so I was fortunate that the international office offered me a job after college. So that helped make the decision. I'm like, all right, let's give this a shot. And then about a year and a half later, the chief program director spot for North Carolina came open. And so I had a wonderful opportunity as a very, you know, young guy relative to the field, but
so
I got to work.
Did you get to travel anywhere?
I did. The Caribbean, I actually got to go to New Zealand and was involved a lot in coach and volunteer training activity, both the design of curriculum and then actually implementing it. And so that was fantastic. And I guess continued my interest and enthusiasm for North Carolina, which has Special Olympics programs in almost all of the 100 counties. So talk about a great orientation to this state. I was able to get on the road and really provide, I think, leadership for many nonprofit organizations.
And how long were you at the Special Olympics?
7 years.
Okay.
And then,
and then what happened? Yeah.
Well, and as others consider a path in nonprofit leadership, it's no secret that fundraising, revenue generation is a critical aspect, as you know, to nonprofits. And I realized that while I had good programmatic experience, I needed to demonstrate fundraising skill. So I went from Special Olympics to UNC Wilmington as a fundraiser first for the athletic department, but then I was in the right place at the right time and ultimately led that entire university's fundraising program as vice chancellor. And
so when you were in Special Olympics, were you in the programs or were you in resource development, or a little bit of both?
A little bit of both, but primarily programs.
Programs. So
that's
because these are interesting kind of like jumps, you know, and I think this is like for those who are listening here about, so because programs, obviously it's a different skill set, you know, I mean, it's specific to the program. Obviously, if you've got funding of a certain level, you need to be aware of what the funders want. You may have different kind of requirements on the ground, but then fundraising is a whole other animal. I mean, you know, like that, these are almost like oil and water into you know, like programs and fundraising, because that's a whole different type of person a lot of times in your organization. Who you have out there fundraising for you is not who you necessarily want, like running your program, and probably vice versa. So tell us about your experience going from programs into becoming sort of like, I guess, the head resource developer.
Yeah, I felt like I could articulate the programs which would help me as a fundraiser. And so that combination, I think, helped me be effective. But I knew that I needed to have the actual responsibility, therefore, the transition to higher education. And in fact, my first job, as I mentioned, was in athletics. So I was raising money for the athletic department, which translated a bit from Special Olympics as an athletic organization as well. But to your point, I do think that's a combination that can help a nonprofit leader, combining both programmatic, you know, what is the core element of the organization, and then effectively seeking investment. And then that's what I did for the next 10 years.
Okay. So after UNCW, you've raised a lot of money for UNCW. Then where did your path take you after that?
Charlotte to Queen's University. Actually, it was Queen's College at the time.
Right.
But I had a unique opportunity to join a president that had just been named. Pamela Davies recently retired as president, but 20 years ago, she was named the president. And so I had the good fortune of joining her on her initial leadership team as the VP for development, and was able to continue as a fundraiser in higher ed. So 5 years in Wilmington, and then 5 years or so at Queen's University. And that's what brought my family to Charlotte.
Okay. And then I guess after, and so you've been raising a lot, you've definitely started to own your craft in fundraising and resource development. And then what?
Then I had the kind of the itch to consult, and I give credit back to the Special Olympic days and to both universities, Dr. Lutzy in Wilmington, Pamela Davies in Charlotte, encouraging me to get involved in the community. And so I worked with a lot of organizations throughout North Carolina in all these settings, and I felt like I had something to offer. So I started PMA Consulting about 12 years ago to allow me to work with nonprofit leaders, primarily around fundraising and strategic planning. But, you know, Rocky, at its core, what I enjoy is working with the leaders of these organizations. It's a tough job, and so I'm happy to help.
Well, I've noticed that so I went on your website, and I went and, and obviously you got this podcast and we should definitely spend a little time, but it seems that, because I think like when I met you, and I think when people had introduced me to you a number of years ago, they said, well, if your nonprofit needs a strategic plan or needs assistance with like coming up with fundraising strategies, Pat McDowell, that's your person. That's who you need to go to. But it looked like when I got there, it's like, it seems that, and it kind of plays in with the name of your podcast and kind of like what we're talking to. We're looking at leaders in the social sector, and it's almost like you are kind of becoming sort of like, it sounds like PMA is evolving into, or at least adding on. I don't think, it doesn't sound like you're getting rid of the other, the other factors. Just is leadership development particularly focused on the nonprofit sector. And so I'd love to kind of like find out like what did you notice in sort of the sector? And then this may very well help talk about our topic about maybe encouraging more people to become nonprofit leaders, to jump over from another sector of that nature. But what did you see that made you think, what, there needs to be more coaching, consulting? I even see you got a mastermind program going on, like with the nonprofit leaders themselves, because it seems like when you think of the nonprofit consult, it's almost all related with the board. It's not that the board aren't leaders, but there's a little bit of a changeover with your board. But I think it sounds like you're looking most at management of the nonprofit. Would that be kind of a correct assessment?
Yeah, great description. And what I found is that while I continue to help with the technical aspects of fundraising or any of the management of a nonprofit, I felt like a need, and what I gravitated to helping was, in essence, a coaching relationship. These executive directors are juggling an incredible amount of activity, often with challenges on the board side. Either their board is micromanaging them, or perhaps disengaged, which creates issues.
I could have used you when I was running.
you know that challenge. And on the other side, Rocky, often there's a lot of turnover on the staff side. So I've just enjoyed working as a kind of partner with an executive director or a chief development officer, helping them manage those dynamics that are a bit more complex. Because most of the time I'm working with a fundraiser, they understand how to do an annual fund. They understand how to do the basics of fundraising. What they're navigating, though, is the choppy waters of their team, their board, their donors, and all of the mechanics associated with that. So a lot of our work now really is leadership development. And I'm convinced if that works out for them, they will be more effective fundraisers. I'm trying to clear the way for them to do the things they want to do and have the talent to do as well.
Well, and I'll give you the opportunity here. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your path to nonprofit leadership? Because I mean, it sounds like we asked the question at the beginning. We've heard your path to nonprofit leadership. But tell us a little about the podcast and the topics that, I mean, I know one of the topics you definitely have covered.
Because you join me.
Yeah. But yeah, tell us a little bit about this podcast and particularly for those in the audience who are nonprofit leaders, because I definitely see at least one nonprofit leader for sure.
I do. Speaking of a great episode, Mary Ward was in fact a wonderful episode on the podcast herself. And so that's something I've tried to lift up.
Yeah.
You're too kind.
No,
Mary was our first guest, actually. We did our way back in the beginning of the leadership series. And so Mary we had the privilege of having Mary on as our first guest. I think we just didn't know that we were going to really do this that often. So unfortunately, I don't think we even pressed record on that one. So Mary, we may have to have you back on and redo. No, well, to talk about something different.
Well, and Rocky,
it'd be a lot of fun.
Mary would be great. And in fact, I would encourage your listeners to check out her episode as well as yours, because the podcast for me is,
we never recorded the one that that was our absolute first one back in like August of 2020 or and but no, Mary, we definitely Shannon knows how to get in touch. We'll be in touch because it's coming on a year, so maybe it's like we try not to have the same guest in a year, but the year's coming up, so definitely.
Well, Rocky, Mary was a guest on my podcast, so you can definitely also have your audience tune in to that episode, because Mary, like so many of the nonprofit leaders I've been able to talk to, have been fantastic. And that's been
and,
the origin of the podcast.
and I'll say this to those in the audience who've been either in the nonprofit sector or thinking about it. Patton's podcast is very exhaustive, meaning that it has a lot of topics that branch all throughout aspects of nonprofit management, leadership, professional development. I would say, I mean, if I were, I would definitely go like and subscribe on iTunes or whatever your preferred podcast listening app is, and just cruise through the titles, because I think that the titles will help you kind of figure out, like, if you really want to talk more about issues like equity or diversity or something, those type of topics, they're in there. But if you want to get in the nitty gritty of how to manage people, in a COVID crisis or any kind of thing, those type of episodes are in there, I think, so, and so I think that would be great. So I think, maybe what we could do is go over the 6 tips for nonprofit transition that you had talked about. And I think that if we whetted your appetite, again, number one, I had a path into the nonprofit sector that I didn't necessarily see, and I think a lot of folks don't. It's almost like I didn't choose nonprofit; it chose me, right? In that regard. And so, for those of you who, and those of you in the audience, again, this episode will be on our YouTube channel. So if you know somebody who's really kind of sitting there at that kind of, and COVID made a lot of people think about their careers. I mean, they made a lot of people think about a lot of things, to be honest. I mean, the year in quarantine, it's a lot of thoughts come to the one's head, but if you or anyone loved one, friend, college roommate, whoever that is thinking about, I want more meaning in my life, but I don't know how to get there. I mean, I've been in corporate America for my entire career. Maybe I bounced from firm to firm, depending on the type of thing, but I just don't know anybody in the nonprofit sector. I mean, yeah, I've been to a fundraiser, I've given some money. I might even served as a board member at one time, but I didn't even know what I was doing then, that kind of thing. But there's something that's calling to you. This would be a great episode for them to listen to. And so at this time, Patton, why don't we start off with these I guess 6 transition tips that and you can choose which order you want to go into. So let's start with what's your first tip?
Yeah, thank you, Rocky, because I've had countless coffees with individuals, obviously before COVID, who I think, and now we're back in it, which I'm excited. And it's well intentioned. I get it. I'll meet with someone who's like, I'm just tired of the corporate grind, and I really am kind of called to get involved in nonprofit. So number one is, I get that, but be careful. The grass is not always greener. And so my first tip is to make sure you're not making an impulse jump from a job that you don't like to thinking that nonprofit work is just going to be better and fun and easier, which again, I want to make clear that nonprofit work is very rewarding, but it's not easy. And so I would suggest, in the reflection before making the jump, talk to some people who are doing jobs that you think you might be interested in. Do the informational interviews with a couple people in different nonprofits. Ask them about their transition, particularly if they jumped. And by the way, I've got some good podcast episodes with nonprofit leaders who came from for-profit. And they talked about their journey, and I think that can be helpful. But that, first of all, Rocky, I guess first advice is, while you may be inspired and called, have some conversations and kind of take some time to reflect on it before you jump.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've started a few, done the legal work for like starting a few nonprofits. And I mean, that word calling is in, a lot of folks just jump into it. I mean, that's founding a nonprofit, which is maybe a little bit the same, but a little bit different than what you're talking about. But so I'm hearing you and I'm like, okay, but what if I don't, I mean, I have a calling. It's almost kind of like something outside of me is calling me to drawing me to the social sector, but I don't I don't know who I want to know. You know, like maybe there's
Right.
like I want to be an executive director, or I want to be a program director, and I don't know anybody who does that. How are there ways that a normal, you know, a civilian can figure their way into
that? That's a great point. It leads to my second point in terms of strategic research. If I were here in Charlotte, and most communities have an Association of Fundraising Professionals job board, AFP. So if you don't yet know a nonprofit leader, be a student of the job descriptions, the job postings, and it'll begin to get you more comfortable with, one, the expectations of these organizations, what they're hiring for, and you can begin to see if your skills translate. I would also engage in community organizations that involve the nonprofit as well as the broader community. For example, your community foundation. Here in Charlotte, of course, we have the Foundation for the Carolinas, but we have a wonderful United Way organization. We have a wonderful Arts and Science Council. These organizations that work with the collective nonprofit communities often host events and would give you an opportunity to mix and mingle with nonprofit leaders as well as the corporate and philanthropic community. So Rocky, like you said, if I were new to town, I'd look on the AFP board, I'd look at the United Way board, I'd look at the staff of these organizations, reach out to them, because they often are conduits for other nonprofit leaders. I served on the AFP board, for example, and there's some wonderful people on that board right now. They're by their nature willing to network. And so when someone's new to town, I'm like, check out the AFP board on their website. And I bet you'll find someone that would be willing to talk to you.
So number one, don't make an impulse decision, right? And I think that's prudent, right? Because just because your boss at your for-profit job ticked you off one day, it may just mean that you need to find another job in that sector. It may not necessarily mean that I need to just sort of change my entire career trajectory, but it might be, right? And so your number two is to do strategic research, things such as obviously look at the Association for Fundraising Professionals. I mean, I think what I've looked around, I know that the NC Center for Nonprofits has a pretty decent job page. That might be one to look at. I think, what do you think about this? Now, there's Share Charlotte, which I know allows you to like volunteer, and maybe they're looking for board members and stuff. Do you think that's a great avenue, or do you think, or any avenue is a good avenue?
Yeah,
because
good example and great advice. In fact, I'd add to my list, I'd call it strategic volunteering. In other words, a lot of times I think people have a wonderful day of experience, and I don't mean to diminish that. Excellent. Special Olympics depends on volunteers to come help on the day of the event. However, if you're thinking about working in the profession, I would suggest you want to volunteer at a deeper level. Sign up for a committee or an initiative or a project or an event that allows you to work over a period of time. And that will give you a better look behind the scenes at the actual work. And again, I don't mean to diminish the feel-good aspect of showing up on a Saturday and helping a nonprofit with their 5K.
Start somewhere, right?
Exactly.
The feeling has to start somewhere, right?
Exactly right. But if you want to better understand nonprofit, volunteer and find ways to volunteer at a deeper level, including, as you said, board service, because that will get you behind the scenes and you'll see the reality of the financial health and the management issues and challenges. And so I would definitely encourage someone pondering a jump to make sure you've had some of that experience so you'll have a better idea. And quite honestly, it also allows that organization to get to know you better, because I have seen examples where a longtime volunteer demonstrates skill and ultimately that becomes a professional marriage. And they're like, hey, do you want to come work here full time? Oh, maybe so.
Yeah, I've seen it a bunch of times, people volunteering in the jobs. I mean, that is
indeed.
When I was in legal aid, I remember there was a law student who had graduated, wanted to work for the program. We didn't have any openings. So they would just volunteer. They were licensed. They just volunteer. They volunteered. Finally, an opening happened. Who's the first person to get hired? The volunteer.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly right.
So what would be the third tip? So obviously no impulse, strategic research. What's number 3?
Invest in the nonprofit profession.
Mm.
The reason I say that is sometimes for-profit candidates will come into a nonprofit interview. Basically, I already know what to do because I've been in for-profit. And you have to be careful that comes across somewhat condescending. That
Right.
because I've been for-profit, I already know how to do real work. And surely you would just be delighted to have me if you're a nonprofit. And people need to realize that nonprofit is a true profession. There are college and graduate courses now, degrees in it. So if you want to impress a potential nonprofit employer, at least make some effort. Take the Duke nonprofit course. Wake Forest offers a wonderful program. The Foundation for the Carolinas offers programs. And I think that demonstrates a genuine interest in the profession versus simply saying, well, because I worked at the bank for 20 years, I'm naturally qualified. You may be, but I think it sends a better signal. And quite honestly, you do need to learn the nuances. Like Rocky, you know, as an attorney working with these organizations, there's some real art and science that someone needs to understand if they're going to work in the nonprofit sector. So take a course, do something to help yourself.
No, I'll tell you, like there was an interim before me, but then my true predecessor, when I took over the nonprofit, when I had my journey there, that was somebody, because again, and we can maybe one day talk about this story about, you said that I kind of inherited an organization that was really just struggling, and that might be an understatement, but how did it get there? Well, we had somebody who didn't technically come from the for-profit, but ran it like it was a for-profit, right?
Right.
This and I mean, to the point where I remember going, when I got in there, they were still there were still those pictures. The guy he spent all his money and bought all these you ever seen those motivational posters, success or passion or something, it's very corporate America kind of thing that I'm like, we're a social service agency. Shouldn't we have pictures of children and what we do and struggle and here it's a lightning bolt is sitting there going success and some weird pithy comment. It was just kind of reflective of the person's total inability to understand what the essence of a nonprofit, a public charity is, and even in its management, not just from, and obviously that bled into how they spent, because we had Head Start money, how you can't spend Head Start money on things that aren't Head Start, that's just almost it was kind of this very command and control. And I think that, when you're, that a lot of stuff many things do translate, I think, from quote unquote for-profit sector, but there is, you're right. There's a nuance and art and also just a culture difference that I think that you've got to kind of be aware of. And I'd say particularly in the nonprofit sector, and then we had Tawani Dewberry on a number of weeks ago.
She's great.
Nonprofits have, depending on the nonprofit, of course, but there's a much more, I would say, you can find, when I took over the Action Agency, I would venture to say that 95% of our workforce were people of color, and pretty much the vast majority of that were women of color. So where you are, maybe you might have a DEI kind of officer, but you may very well take over an organization that doesn't look like you at all. And I think those are some nuanced things that you will find in the nonprofit sector. You will find overwhelming, diverse workforces that you may not necessarily see on the for-profit side.
Absolutely
in very stark ways where your cultural competence needs to be just ramped up to 11, and such. And so I think those are, So I love the third tip, invest in the non-profit profession, because it is a profession. It is a certain skill set. It is not, you can't just go to Portugal speaking Spanish.
That's a good way to put it. And that I've seen, Rocky, well-intentioned lateral entry candidates crash and burn. You know, their passion gets them in the door maybe, but then they realize, uh-oh, I don't have an IT person to call here because there's not one, or I don't have HR to call on because they're not here. You're wearing many hats. You're doing a very different job, and that sometimes comes as a shock.
So it almost is like 3 is invest in nonprofit and respect the nonprofit profession as a profession in and of itself. Because
great way to put it.
Yeah.
Absolutely right.
What's your 4th tip?
Strategic networking, again, for a variety of reasons, similar to doing your research. But the good news is that everybody has, I think, individuals that serve on a nonprofit board, they're friends, they're involved. If not, as you said, we can't find a staff person, but I alluded to it earlier. If you're going to work in the nonprofit sector in a community, you need to get to know the philanthropic landscape. And so I would start studying these topics that affect nonprofits on the program side, on the philanthropy side, on the governance side. And the best way to do that, again, I think, is get involved. Go to a monthly meeting of AFP Charlotte, or as you said, North Carolina Center for Nonprofits does great programming. It'll frankly make you more comfortable and conversant in the topics that someone that might want to hire you is going to want to know you're comfortable speaking. So there are ways to get involved, different councils. The Foundation for the Carolinas is another example. I'm part of a program called the New Development Director Program, or New Development Professional, which has been, I think, I'm biased, of course, but it's a program designed for someone new to the community or thinking about going into nonprofit work, which is a way, again, to network and help them orient to, hopefully, a successful transition into the field.
Yeah, I think that, Charlotte is a very philanthropic town. That's been my, my experience here. And I think that you just got to take that leap of faith, meaning I'm not saying take the job or try to get, but as far as the strategic networking goes, is that people are very busy, so don't be necessarily like despondent if, like, you sent an email, a cold email to somebody. I think LinkedIn is a way to kind of like get at people. If there's somebody, just shoot them a friend request, even if they don't, you don't know somebody. A lot of people just will answer it just because they want to, and then you just shoot them a regular message and see if you can get in that way. But I do think that I would say, based on this, strategic networking is, don't be despondent if, like, people don't get back to you right away. It may take some time. You may need to actually use the phone to call people, because I just noticed that even almost a generational difference in some people don't talk on the phone anymore, right? So if you're if you're, so vice versa, it's like if you're trying to get with maybe a younger, like, nonprofit professional, try to, they almost want to, like, get a text or a phone call, an email or something versus a phone call, versus older generation doesn't even like playing with the text and the emails. They want you to actually call them and leave a voicemail or something, and they will call you back. But I would just say, yeah, if you're in the Charlotte area, most people are they are busy, but at the same time, you could probably get coffee with, if you tried 10, you'd get coffee with 1. That, I feel pretty strongly about that. Maybe
I agree.
5, actually. But,
if you're respectful in your outreach and that you're respectful of their time, I do think folks that are in the nonprofit sector, they want talent to join them. So I think they'd be open to it. And by the way, Rocky, what you can do is be thoughtful around the sectors that interest you, which would help your research. So in other words, if I'm touched by healthcare, then I might want to look for people in the healthcare sector of nonprofit, but I might be in the arts and culture space or education. So that might help narrow your focus and allow you to network strategically.
Yeah, that's right, because not everyone in the nonprofit sector knows. Maybe the EDs might know just for these type of programming, but it's so. The nonprofit sector is just as vast as any other sector, because nonprofits affect almost just about every activity that man can think of in some respects. So there's that. So you got your strategic networking. You're starting to meet with folks. What would be tip number 5?
Utilize your for-profit strengths. As much as I've been saying, be sensitive to it. What I would emphasize, though, is to use nonprofit vocabulary. Again, I've seen a lot of folks come into interviews and they use corporate speak. And there is something about the sales cycle that could apply to nonprofit philanthropy. But I'd rather you use philanthropic terms around giving and fundraising and things like that than just try to bulldoze corporate speak.
How would someone learn? Like, is there like a translation book? Like, it's like,
yeah,
the English to Spanish, vice versa. Is there a
I need to come up with that.
Well, because I know when I was running a nonprofit, I had a lot of vendors trying to sell me stuff, and almost to a salesperson, it was always like, "I've got a solution for you." I was like,
right.
I was like, and that as a nonprofit person, I'm like, that's very, I don't know, ambitious to say that you're gonna solve a solution, but it's almost every vendor had a solution. Almost they had a memo that went through their ranks, but like, how, if I am like the person who's always saying terms like, well, let's help you find a solution for this or something like that. Is it through one of these courses, like one of these certificate courses or something that I would learn? Is there a book that I could read that could, help me stop being so, I don't know, for-profit in my diction? I mean, how can I translate my for-profit translate? Obviously I know how to use Excel. I know how to do all this other, these things here. How can I leverage those strengths and yet sort of not turn people off with sort of like high pressure sales talk?
Yeah, and that's probably the best example to use, because effective salespeople do indeed have skills that will translate. But I would suggest, to your question, again, use resources like the Association of Fundraising Professionals or something like that can translate sales speak into what I would call the philanthropic cycle. That, again, yes, it's all based on relationship building, and that's something you want to translate. But
go ahead. Sorry.
I would just use, just as they have, utilized the CRM in their corporate setting to generate business, there is a similar data management element to identifying the best prospects for invitation to invest in your nonprofit. So and that's back to these informational interviews. Talk to some people doing the work, let them speak, and that gives you, I think, a common vocabulary. So when you're in an interview, you can talk about, I understand what's involved in the cultivation of donor prospects, and I understand the difference between an annual fund, a capital campaign, and a legacy gift. See, that would be an example where a salesperson may have a kind of straight and narrow selling a product.
Yeah.
But actually, philanthropy has different channels of revenue generation. And if you can articulate that, you're way ahead of someone who cannot.
Yeah, and I think there definitely is. I mean, this is my perspective. I think if you are transitioning, like maybe you're a salesperson, I mean, I think that if you are a resource developer in the nonprofit, that you really, I believe in the mission of what you are, what the organization you're representing. I mean, you've got to, I mean, I know, because like when you're selling, like, I don't know, copying machines, right? I mean, in reality, you probably don't really think there's much of a difference between your Canon and your Kyocera, right? I mean, but because Canon is paying your bills, Canon is number one, right? But I think that where resource development is, and I think that the donors and such, if they can pick up that and it's not that hard. If you were driven to the nonprofit sector, you must obviously believe in the mission. Don't be bashful about how much you actually believe in what you're doing, because that passion that's how you make the sale. I mean, you make the sale in that regard, I think, in many respects, that and just the track record and what you've been able to really kind of accomplish. But yeah, I mean, I think those are well, here's a question kind of in that utilize your for-profit strength. So we've got salespeople who are trained salespeople can find a niche in in the nonprofit sector. Can you give some other examples of sort of standard for-profit type of workers or employees or and where they might be able to transition into the nonprofit sector? Because there's a lot of, like if I'm a financial planner and or I'm a lawyer, well, I mean, there's a lot of different folks who, who are, I'm an HR person, things of that nature. Like what would be your sort of like your tips to these type of like kind of like your standard folks, like I'm a staff accountant for, this blankety blank firm or something like that.
Yeah, well, and you've given several great examples, and nonprofits need often those exact skill sets. I'm thinking about data analysis and data management. Obviously, the business side of any nonprofit requires financial acumen, communications and marketing. I've seen successful transitions. So those are skills that in the for-profit and certainly are necessary on the nonprofit side: social media, website, and all the related activities of marketing and communications. Project management is a skill that I think translates well. So if you've done that in your for-profit life, that's something I think I'd put front and center, because ultimately nonprofits need people that can get things done, often with limited resources. We've talked about it in the fundraising. So any evidence you have of relationship building, managing a team, I mean, these are absolutely transferable skills. So the good news is almost any skill in the for-profit arena has a place in nonprofits. But as we have alluded to earlier, you want to be proactive in understanding the vocabulary on the other side of that fence. And I think that will make the nonprofit leader more receptive, because that's the question in their mind, Rocky. They're asking, all right, I know this person's talented, but do they really understand what they're getting into? Because I don't want to risk bringing them over and then they crash and burn.
They leave. Yeah, because I think like the goal and I think that you see it a little bit more in nonprofit, at least in my experience, is just there are more people who are lifers, in the staff that when I make a hire, I was looking for somebody who they really believed in the mission, of course, and that they obviously had the skill set necessary, and that they could see that, and I know it's a standard question, you see yourself here for 5 years, whatever, the rest of your career. But, I think because at nonprofits, it's like there's so many, it's like there's such institutional knowledge that really needs to be sort of safeguarded. We can't just have folks just kind of coming in, and I mean, at least definitely in the management position. It's almost a kiss of death if you've got, from a nonprofit, if you've got so much turnover and particularly senior management positions, that I don't know if it's easy, a nonprofit can withstand that as much as say a for-profit can.
Exactly right. And so
because of the level of institutional knowledge and relationship building you have to have in a nonprofit versus, I mean, there's certain management skills and such, but I think that they're definitely, you've got to, I almost say like, you've got to kind of got to risk, the 76, respect the process, there's a certain, there's a certain thing there. So leveraging your for-profit strengths, what would be the final tip that you would have for folks?
Really think carefully about your personal organizational systems and methods. It's a generalization, I know, but I think by and large, you will have to do more activity in the nonprofit world with less resources to support you. So you have to be effective at juggling lots of data, lots of activity, lots of tasks. And so a question I always ask when I'm part of interviews for nonprofits is, explain to me how you manage the volume, because you will get a lot of volume. And if you're comfortable in that, then great. But I don't care how you do it, but I want to make sure you have a system that nothing falls through the cracks. And you not only capture everything, but you prioritize, because I need to be assured you can get things done independently, and also need to know that you can utilize multiple skills. Seldom, Rocky, do nonprofits have the luxury of hiring an absolute specialist. you're often doing a combination. You're doing fundraising, but you're doing some marketing and some event planning. And so it's the more reason that I need to know you can manage multiple activities. And final point, because I do a workshop around, I think there are in fact 10 skills and experiences that effective nonprofit leaders need to have. And so in summary, it's a combination of things. You've got to be able to write, you've got to be able to speak, you've got to be able to organize, you got to manage people. And some people love that and will excel, but I just want others to go in with their eyes open, because you're going to have to manage effectively a great deal of activity.
No, I would say definitely when it comes to like the nonprofit sector, particularly here in the Charlotte area, I mean, and I think for those in the audience, if you know somebody, and maybe I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but would it be fine for somebody to call you, if they just said, I heard about this podcast, this webcast, I've been thinking about it, yeah, because I think that this type of information would be great to hear. And you've got a lot of programs. I thought it was really interesting you got a mastermind, because that's something that is very big in the for-profit sector. Like, you hear about you hear a lot about masterminds, and maybe you could talk a little bit about the mastermind that you've got going on, because it's focused on nonprofit leaders, which is interesting.
It's been among the most rewarding things I've done. We're in the third cohort already, and we've got demand, significant demand for the next round coming up this fall. Basically, I'm putting 8 talented nonprofit leaders together in a virtual setting over 3 months and allowing them a safe space to evaluate their strengths and weaknesses as a nonprofit leader and look to the future. Obviously, the path to nonprofit leadership, the title of my podcast, is a theme for the mastermind too, regardless of where they are on the path, whether they're a veteran and kind of trying to evaluate where they go at the finish of their career, or a rising star. And the interaction's been great. And so that's certainly for those of your audience that might be in the nonprofit space. I would welcome their interest. And to your previous question, Rocky, yes, I'm happy for your audience to reach out. They can find me on LinkedIn. I'm active there. Of course, our website, pattonmcdowell.com, has information on me, our firm, and things like the mastermind program.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we are getting close to the end of the hour here, so I want to open it up to questions. I know we don't have like a great, but you know what? This may be the best time to ask questions. So anyone got some questions for myself or Patton about the transition from a for-profit to a nonprofit job? If you're thinking about it, if you know somebody who's been thinking about it, this would be a great time to kind of at least share a comment or ask a question. You can just unmute yourself and just hop in, because we're just, or not.
Well, appreciate the emoji from Mary Ward. Like I said, she was wonderful to have, speaking of talent in our community. But yeah, like I said, Rocky, if questions occur to people as they watch this in the recorded form, I'd be happy to connect with them there as well.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you everybody for attending today's leadership series. I know that it's I think we even talked about earlier. I think people might be getting zoomed out. It's
exactly.
It's been kind of the communication du jour for some time now, but sometimes it's people wanting to kind of get in front of people again, go out to coffee, go to lunch, do their networking that way. But we will continue to do the leadership series, and we will continue to upload them onto our YouTube channel. And of course, if you want to obviously talk to Patton, but I highly recommend, if you have any interest in the nonprofit sector or whatsoever, I subscribed, I liked, the whole thing. Just again, if you're in iTunes, Spotify, I guess it's on Spotify or
I think it's on all the platforms. Yes.
Yeah. Get on. Yeah. Just listen to a couple episodes, and you know what? The best episode to listen to, the one with me as the guest. That's the best episode to listen to. So
we'll happily connect them with your episode, Rocky, for sure.
And well, thank you so much, Dr. Patton McDowell, and when did you become a doctor, and how are your patients? Just kidding. I know you're
Yeah, I'm not qualified to deal with that.
Yeah, I got something wrong here. What's going on?
Can't help you there, Rocky. But no, my doctorate's in education, so organizational change and leadership, in fact. So that was a fun program.
I know I said it before, but congratulations on obtaining your doctorate and becoming a PhD, a doctor. That's fantastic.
Yeah, appreciate that,
so,
Rocky.
Well, I guess if you've got a nonprofit ailment, you need to call the doctor.
That's my new tagline, Rocky. Yes, good. You nailed it.
I like it. I like it. All right, guys. Well, thank you again so much, and we'll be back next time. I think we're next week. I'm sure you know the gentleman. We'll be talking about science funding in the city of Charlotte with Jim Warren from Carolina Raptor Center, and find out what's going on with the Carolina Raptor Center. I know a lot of crazy stuff going on, a lot of plantation, but they're not part of that. So at least we'll. Yeah, if you want to talk, we're going to talk, because I know there's been a lot of talk about the arts funding, but you know what? It's called an Arts and Science Council, but what about the science funding? So that's what we're going to talk about. What about science? What happened to science funding, and how can we support our science-based public charities and nonprofits here in Charlotte? So come by next week. We'll be on. I think it's next Wednesday, same time, same bat channel, same bat, everything. So if you know that reference, then you're older as I. All right. Thank you, Pat, and take care.
Thanks,
everybody.
Rocky. Appreciate you having me. Appreciate it. Bye.